The sky was turning gray as the sun set behind the hills. Dark clouds gathered, and the wind grew cold. A German shepherd named Max sat in the back seat of a car, his ears perked up. He loved car rides. They always led to fun places, the park, the river, or the big fields where he could run freely. But this time, something felt different. His owner, a man in a dark jacket, was driving in silence. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The car slowed down near an empty roadside, far from town. The man pulled over, his face tense. He looked at Max but didn't speak. Instead, he opened the door and stepped outside. Max wagged his tail, waiting for his owner to call him. But instead of playing or running, the man clipped off Max's collar and tossed it aside. "Go on," he said in a low voice, his eyes avoiding Max. Max tilted his head. He didn't understand. His owner had never spoken like this before. The man walked back to the car and got inside. The door shut. Then, before Max could jump in, the engine roared to life. The car sped forward, kicking up dust from the road. Max barked in surprise. His strong legs pushed forward as he ran after the car, his heart pounding. He ran as fast as he could. The wind rushed past his ears. His paws pounded against the dirt road. He barked again, louder this time. But the car didn't stop. Max chased it for as long as his legs would carry him. His breaths grew heavier, his body aching, but he wouldn't stop. He couldn't stop. His owner was just ahead. He just had to catch up. Then, the red taillights faded into the distance. The car turned a corner and disappeared. Max skidded to a stop, his chest rising and falling. His tongue hung from his mouth as he panted, confused. He looked around. The road was empty. There were no houses, no people, just the whisper of the wind and the rustling of dry leaves. He turned in a slow circle, his ears twitching. His tail, once wagging, hung low. Where did his owner go? Would he come back? The night grew colder and darkness spread over the land. Max lay down near the roadside, his head resting on his paws. Every time a car passed, his ears perked up, and he lifted his head. His eyes followed the lights, hoping, praying, that one of them would be his owner returning for him. But no one stopped. The first night was long. Hunger gnawed at his belly, and the cold air made him shiver. He wasn't used to sleeping alone like this. He missed his warm bed, the soft blanket, the gentle hands that used to scratch behind his ears. But still he waited. The next morning, Max stood and stretched. His legs ached, but he didn't move far. The sun rose, warming his fur. He watched the road, hoping to see the familiar car again. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe his owner had only gone away for a short time. Maybe today he would come back. But the day passed, and no one came. By the second night, Max's stomach growled loudly. His throat was dry. He walked a few steps, sniffing the air. He caught the scent of food coming from a small store nearby. People passed him, some stopping to look. A kind woman placed a bowl of water near him. He drank quickly, but did not follow her when she called him. His place was here. And so he waited. Days turned into weeks, but Max did not leave. He sat near the roadside, eyes fixed on the road. Every morning, he woke up with the same hope. Maybe today, his owner would come back. But each day ended the same way. The cars passed, the people walked by, but no familiar face appeared. The townspeople began to notice the lonely dog. Some felt sorry for him. Others admired his loyalty. Children pointed at him from bus windows. Store owners whispered about him while arranging their goods. Everyone knew Max, but no one could get close. An elderly woman named Mrs. Callahan was one of the first to help. She lived nearby and had a kind heart. Every afternoon, she placed a small bowl of food near Max's spot. "Here you go, boy," she would say softly. Max would wait until she stepped back, then slowly eat. But no matter how kind she was, he never followed her home. One day, a young man named Jake, who worked at the bakery, crouched near Max. He held out a fresh bread roll. "Hey, buddy, you must be hungry." Max sniffed the air. The bread smelled good, but he didn't move. Jake sighed. "You're waiting for someone, huh?" Max blinked, but didn't respond. Word spread about the loyal German shepherd who refused to leave. People stopped to watch him. Some tried to pet him, but Max would step back. He never barked or growled. He was not afraid. He was simply waiting. Seasons changed, but Max stayed. Summer turned into autumn. The leaves changed color, and the air became crisp. Max curled up in the same spot every night, his thick fur keeping him warm. Then came winter. Snow fell, covering the streets in white. Some days were bitterly cold, and the wind howled through the trees. Mrs. Callahan brought an old blanket and left it near Max. "It's not much, but it'll help," she said. Max sniffed the blanket, then lay down on it. For the first time in months, he felt warmth. But still, he did not leave. People came and went. Some strangers tried to take Max home. A family with 2 kids stopped their car and called him over. The little girl held out a treat. "Come with us, doggy. We'll take care of you." Max wagged his tail slightly but did not move. Another time, an animal rescuer came with a leash. "It's not safe for him to stay out here," she said. But as soon as she got too close, Max took a few steps back. He wasn't aggressive, just unwilling to leave. Mrs. Callahan shook her head. "You won't take him unless he wants to go." And Max did not want to go. A storm brings fear. One evening, dark clouds filled the sky. The wind grew strong, and thunder rumbled in the distance. The townspeople hurried inside, closing their windows and doors. Max curled up tightly, his ears twitching at the loud sounds. Rain started to pour, soaking the ground. A bolt of lightning flashed across the sky, followed by a loud clap of thunder. For the first time, Max whimpered. Mrs. Callahan watched from her window, her heart aching. "Poor boy," she whispered. "How much longer can he stay out there?" The storm raged on, but Max did not leave. He had only one thought in his heart. What if his owner came back, and he wasn't there? And so he stayed. Months passed, and Max's life became a quiet routine. The seasons changed again. Spring came with bright sunshine and flowers blooming, but Max was always there, near the bus stop, never leaving. The people of the town had grown used to him. Some even began to speak about him like he was part of the town itself. Max was the unofficial guardian of the road. No one dared to leave the town without seeing him, sitting tall with his fur glistening in the sunlight. But there was something different about Max. His eyes still searched the passing cars, hoping for the one that would bring his owner back. Every morning, Mrs. Callahan would drop off food, carefully placing it in the same spot. "Eat up, boy," she would say, her voice soft with concern. Max would look at her with grateful eyes, but his paws remained in the same place. He never wandered far. The food was appreciated, but the waiting was his true job. The local children grew fond of Max. They'd stop on their way home from school, watching him from a distance. Sometimes they'd sit quietly on the sidewalk, and Max would watch them with the same patient gaze he used for the cars. It was almost as though he was sharing his vigil with them. But as the years passed, Max grew older. His once proud fur became thinner. His legs moved a little slower. He still wagged his tail when Mrs. Callahan called to him, but it wasn't the same as before. The years had worn on him. Yet, despite the aching in his bones, Max did not leave. One day, as the sun set and the cool breeze rustled the leaves, a man came to town. He was young, with a tired face and a worn-out coat. His name was Daniel, and he had recently moved to the area. He didn't know much about the town, but he had heard people talking about the dog. On his first day in town, Daniel walked past the bus stop where Max sat. He had heard the stories and thought, "There's the dog." Daniel had his own dog when he was younger, and he had heard how Max had waited for years. never leaving the spot where his owner had abandoned him. At first, Daniel felt sorry for Max. He had seen the dog every time he passed by. The loyal animal, always there, looking for something, waiting for someone. Poor guy, Daniel thought. But then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the light grew dim, something unexpected happened. Max raised his head and sniffed the air. His ears perked up, and he stood. His legs were stiff from the cold, but he moved toward the edge of the sidewalk, his eyes focused. Daniel froze. He had been walking past, just another person in the crowd, but something in Max's movement made him stop. Max was watching the cars, his body tense, as if something important was about to happen. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt a strange sense of hope in the air. "What's going on, boy?" Daniel asked, his voice low and curious. Max didn't look at him, but he gave a soft, low whine. It was as if he were calling out to something. Daniel took a cautious step forward, not wanting to interrupt the moment. He stood there for a while, watching Max, whose gaze was fixed on the road. Cars drove by, but none of them slowed. Max's eyes, though tired, still searched. It was then that Daniel understood. Max wasn't just waiting for anyone. He was waiting for his person. No matter how much time had passed, Max's heart had not given up hope. "I get it now," Daniel whispered. The days grew colder, and with the approaching winter, the town seemed quieter. The leaves had fallen from the trees, and the streets were lined with frost. Max continued his watch, sitting by the bus stop, looking at every car that passed. He was getting weaker, but his heart remained strong. Each car that came and went made him hope a little more that his owner might return. But as the days went on, that hope started to feel like a distant memory. One evening, just as the sun began to set, a red car appeared in the distance. Max perked up, his ears standing tall. He watched the car carefully, hoping beyond hope that this might be the one. The car slowed as it approached, and Max's heart raced. Was this it? Could it be his owner coming back? But something felt different about this car. The driver didn't slow down as much as Max thought they should. The car sped closer, and before Max could even react, the driver lost control. The vehicle swerved suddenly, sliding on the slick road toward Max. Max's eyes widened in fear. He jumped to his feet, his old legs stiff and slow. But even though he tried, he couldn't move fast enough. The car was coming straight for him. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Max tried to leap out of the way, but the car's tires screeched as it slid uncontrollably toward him. In one final desperate attempt, Max darted to the side, but the car clipped his back leg as it passed by. Pain shot through Max's body, and he let out a low whimper. He collapsed onto the ground, his injured leg unable to hold him up. The car finally came to a stop. The driver panicked, but Max's body lay still. For a moment, everything was quiet. The car's engine hummed in the distance, but Max couldn't move. He lay there, trembling, his breath shallow. Was this the end? Had he waited too long? But then he felt a hand gently touch his head. It was warm, soft, and kind. He looked up through his blurry vision to see a man kneeling beside him. His face was worried, his hand shaking as he checked Max's leg. "Hold on, buddy. You're going to be okay," the man whispered. His voice was calm, but Max could hear the worry underneath it. The man carefully lifted Max's injured leg, trying not to hurt him further. "I've got you. Don't worry," he said, his voice steady as he stood up with Max in his arms. Max's eyes fluttered as the man carried him to the side of the road. A few moments later, another car arrived. The driver stepped out quickly, a woman with a kind face. "We need to get him to a vet," the woman said, urgency in her voice. The man nodded, and they hurried to the car. Max felt the soft touch of the man's hands as he gently placed him in the back seat. He wanted to lift his head, but the pain in his leg was too much. He could feel the warmth of the car around him as the man and woman climbed inside. As the car sped away, Max's head rested on the seat, his eyes half closed. He had never been in a car like this before. It felt strange, but it was warm, and for the first time in a long while, he felt safe. Through the foggy windows, he watched the world blur past. The night sky seemed endless, but in that moment, Max knew he wasn't alone. Max woke up in a warm, quiet place. His leg throbbed with pain, but it wasn't as sharp as before. He blinked his tired eyes and looked around. Soft lights hung from the ceiling, and the smell of antiseptic was in the air. It was a small room, and he was lying on a comfy bed covered with a blanket. The man who had carried him here was sitting nearby, looking worried. His face was familiar, but Max couldn't quite remember where he had seen him before. The man was stroking his fur gently. Max's eyes softened. Even though he was still in pain, there was something about the man's touch that made him feel comforted. "Hey, buddy, how are you feeling?" the man asked quietly, his voice soft but kind. Max blinked and let out a weak whine. He felt so tired, but the warmth of the room made him feel safe. Max's thoughts were hazy. He had never been inside a place like this before. But before he could think more, the door opened, and a woman walked in. She was wearing a white coat, and she smiled when she saw Max. "Looks like someone is waking up," she said, walking over and checking his leg. Max flinched a little, but the woman's touch was gentle. "You're going to be just fine," she said, looking at the man with a reassuring smile. "The injury isn't too bad. With some rest, he should be back to his old self soon." The man sighed with relief. "Thank you, Dr. Shaw," he said, standing up. "You're welcome. Just make sure he doesn't overdo it. Let him heal at his own pace," she advised before leaving the room. Max's eyes followed the man, still confused. There was something about him, something Max knew, deep inside, but couldn't place. The man sat beside the bed, looking at Max with a soft expression on his face. "I'm glad you're okay," the man said. Max's ears perked up. He tilted his head, sensing something important in the way the man spoke. There was a deep connection, a sense of recognition. The man's eyes softened as he reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, familiar-looking leather keychain. It had a small, worn-out dog tag attached to it. Max's heart skipped a beat. He knew that tag. He had seen it before. It was his tag. Max blinked, his breath catching. The man's voice was quiet as he spoke again. "I know you remember this." Slowly, the man stood and walked to the window. The light outside was dimming, and Max could see the street below. People were walking by, cars were driving, and life went on, just like it had before. But for Max, the world had suddenly changed. Memories rushed back. The man's face, though older, was the same face Max had once known so well. His heart raced as the memory flooded his mind. This was Daniel, the young boy who had been his owner long ago. Max had once lived in a small house with Daniel, running in the fields, playing fetch, and curling up on the couch together. But something had happened. Daniel's family had to move, and they had to leave Max behind. Max never forgot. He had waited for Daniel, day after day, year after year, never leaving the spot where he had been left. And now, after all that time, Daniel was finally here, standing in front of him, just as he had been before. Daniel turned back to Max, his eyes full of emotion. "I'm sorry, boy," he said softly. "I didn't mean to leave you behind. I was just a kid back then, and I didn't know what to do." Max's tail began to wag weakly. His heart swelled with recognition and love. After all these years, after all the waiting, he was finally with the one person he had never stopped loving. Daniel crouched down beside the bed, gently stroking Max's fur. "I've missed you so much," he whispered, "and I'm never leaving you again." Max's eyes sparkled, and for the first time in a long time, he felt complete. The days that followed were filled with gentle care and quiet moments. Max's leg healed slowly, and every day, Daniel stayed close by. He would sit beside Max's bed, talking to him softly, reminding him of the good times they once shared. Max listened, his heart full of memories and love for the person who had returned. It wasn't just the warmth of the room that made Max feel safe now. It was the presence of someone who understood him, someone who had loved him before. Daniel would bring food and water for Max, gently feeding him when he wasn't feeling strong enough to eat on his own. Max would nuzzle into his hand, trusting him completely. One evening, Daniel sat by the window, looking out at the darkening sky. Max lay beside him, resting his head on Daniel's lap. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of the clock ticking. Max's eyes were closed, and his breathing had become steady and calm. "I'm so sorry I left you," Daniel said softly, his voice filled with regret. "I was young, and I didn't understand what you needed. But now I know. I'm never leaving you again, Max. You're my family." Max opened one eye and looked up at him, his tail giving a faint wag. He couldn't understand the words, but he could feel the meaning. The warmth in Daniel's voice was all he needed. He nuzzled closer, resting his head on Daniel's knee as the quiet night surrounded them. Days passed, and Max grew stronger. He began to walk on his leg, though it still hurt a little. He could feel the stiffness in his joints, but each day it got a little better. Daniel took him on short walks around the neighborhood, letting Max lead the way, just like old times. Max loved the fresh air, the sounds of birds singing, and the warm sunshine on his fur. People in the town started to notice Daniel and Max again. They had heard the story of the dog who had waited so long, and now they saw the bond between them. Some stopped to smile and greet them, while others whispered about the miraculous reunion. Max was no longer the lonely dog at the bus stop. He was part of the town again, but this time with a family by his side. One morning, Daniel took Max to the park. It was a bright and sunny day, and the air smelled fresh and clean. Max's tail wagged with excitement as they arrived. The park was busy with families and children playing, but Max didn't care. He ran to his favorite spot, a big tree at the edge of the field, and lay down in the soft grass, basking in the sunlight. Daniel sat beside him, watching with a smile. He felt a warmth inside his chest as he saw Max so happy. After all the time they had been apart, it was as if nothing had changed. The bond they shared was still strong, just like it had been all those years ago. "We'll never be apart again," Daniel whispered to Max, scratching behind his ears. Max lifted his head and gave Daniel a loving nudge. It wasn't just the healing of his leg that brought Max peace, it was the healing of his heart. The loneliness that had once weighed him down was gone, replaced with the joy of being with the one person he had never stopped waiting for. As the sun set, casting a golden glow across the park, Max lay beside Daniel, his head resting on his knee. He closed his eyes, feeling content and at home. The road that had once seemed endless was now a path that led to a new beginning. The waiting was over. Daniel had returned, and this time Max knew he would never have to wait again. It had been a few weeks since Max's injury, and every day he felt stronger and happier. His leg no longer hurt as much, and he was back to his old self, running, playing, and wagging his tail at everything in sight. Daniel's life had also found a rhythm again, and the two of them had become inseparable. One morning, Daniel woke up early and looked out the window. The sky was clear, the air fresh, and the sun was just beginning to rise. He turned to Max, who was curled up beside him, resting peacefully. "Come on, Max. It's a beautiful day. Let's go for a walk," Daniel said, scratching the dog's head. Max's ears perked up, and he wagged his tail in excitement. He loved these walks. They had become a daily ritual, and today felt special, like something wonderful was waiting just around the corner. As Daniel got ready, Max trotted around the house, excited for their adventure. The day felt different, full of promise. There was a sense of happiness in the air that Max could feel in his bones. After breakfast, they stepped outside. The world was still quiet, with only the sound of birds chirping in the trees. Max sniffed the air, taking in the fresh scent of the morning. He looked up at Daniel, who was smiling down at him. It was the kind of smile that said everything. Everything was right in the world. Together, they walked through the town, enjoying the peacefulness of the morning. The town had started to feel like home again for both of them. The people who had once whispered about Max now greeted him with smiles and waves. Max wagged his tail at everyone they passed, happy to see familiar faces. He didn't need to wait anymore. He was part of the world now, not just a dog waiting for someone. After walking for a while, they reached the park. It was the same park where they had shared so many memories, and it felt like the perfect place for the next chapter of their journey. Max bounded ahead, running in circles, his ears flapping in the wind. Daniel laughed and watched him, feeling a sense of joy that he hadn't felt in years. Max stopped and looked back at Daniel, his eyes shining. He wanted Daniel to see how happy he was. This was his world now. Daniel sat down on the grass, and Max joined him, curling up beside him. They sat together in silence for a few moments, just enjoying the warmth of the sun and the peacefulness of the world around them. Daniel reached out and gently scratched Max behind the ears, making the dog's tail wag even faster. "You've always been my best friend, Max," Daniel said softly, looking at him with deep affection. "I'm so glad I found you again. I don't ever want to let you go." Max looked up at him, as if understanding every word. He nuzzled his head against Daniel's arm, as if to say, "I'm here, and I'm never leaving." Suddenly, a young boy ran past, laughing and chasing a ball. Max perked up, his ears twitching, and he got up, ready to play. He ran after the ball, and Daniel stood to watch. He laughed as Max zoomed across the field, chasing the ball with all the energy and excitement he had when he was younger. For a moment, Daniel felt a rush of emotion. The bond they shared was stronger than anything he could have imagined. It was as if the years of waiting and the pain of the past had melted away, leaving only pure, unconditional love between them. After playing for a while, Max returned to Daniel, tired but happy. He lay down at Daniel's feet, his head resting in his lap. "I think we've had enough excitement for today," Daniel said, smiling as he stroked Max's fur. "But I'm proud of you, buddy. You've come a long way." Max closed his eyes, feeling content. He had found his home, and the waiting was finally over. He was where he belonged, with the person who loved him, and nothing else mattered. As they sat together, enjoying the peace and quiet, Daniel made a promise to himself. No matter what happened, he would always be there for Max. They had both waited long enough. Now, they would live every day together, forever. Months passed, and life for Max and Daniel grew even more peaceful. The bond they shared had deepened, and every day felt like a new adventure. They spent their mornings walking through the town, their afternoons playing at the park, and their evenings curled up together at home. Max had fully recovered from his injury, and his energy seemed endless. He was no longer the tired, lonely dog who had waited for years at the bus stop. He was a happy, playful dog with a loving family. One sunny afternoon, Daniel decided to take Max on a special trip. They were going to visit the place where it all began, the small house where Max had lived with Daniel when he was a puppy. It had been years since they had left that home, but Daniel wanted Max to see it again. Max jumped excitedly into the car, his tail wagging as they drove through the town. The familiar streets passed by, and Max stuck his head out the window, enjoying the breeze on his face. Every turn they made seemed like a step back in time. When they arrived, Daniel parked the car outside the house. It was just as he remembered, small, cozy, with a little garden out front. Max sniffed the air as they stepped out of the car, and his eyes sparkled. This was home. Together, they walked to the front door. Daniel paused for a moment, his hand on the handle, and then smiled. He could almost hear the laughter of his younger self and feel the warmth of the days when Max had been by his side. He opened the door, and the house felt just like it had when they lived there before. The old wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the familiar smell of the place filled his nostrils. Daniel knelt down and scratched Max's ears. "This was our home, buddy. We had so many good times here." Max wagged his tail, sniffing around the house, exploring every corner. He seemed to recognize the place, even though it had been so long. The memories flooded back to him, the long walks, the games of fetch, and the quiet evenings with Daniel. As the sun began to set, Daniel and Max sat down in the small backyard, just as they had done many times before. Max lay on the soft grass, his head resting on Daniel's knee. Daniel looked at the sky, his heart full of gratitude. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Daniel said softly, his voice full of emotion. "I never should have left you, Max. I should have known you were waiting for me. But I promise I will never leave you again. We're in this together, forever." Max lifted his head and looked up at Daniel, his eyes full of understanding. He gave a soft bark, as if agreeing with every word. His tail wagged slowly as he nuzzled Daniel's hand. The evening air was cool, and the stars began to appear in the sky above. It was a perfect moment, peaceful, quiet, and full of love. Daniel looked down at Max, the dog who had waited for him, the dog who had never given up hope. "You're my best friend, Max," Daniel whispered. "I'm so lucky to have you." Max nuzzled closer, his head resting on Daniel's lap once again. In that moment, everything felt right. There was no more waiting. There were no more lonely days. Max had found his home with Daniel, and Daniel had found his best friend. Together, they had healed, and together, they would continue to face whatever came their way. They had both learned that love and loyalty could overcome even the toughest of times. And as they sat there under the stars, Daniel made a promise to Max, not just for today, but for the future. No matter what happened, they would always be there for each other. Max was no longer waiting. He had found where he truly belonged.